Alright everyone, it's time for Occult Literature, video number 296, Gnani Yoga, which is sometimes spelled with a J instead of a G. Link in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon. This is another full-length Atkinson work, 217 pages, almost 300 in the original edition, but it tends to shorten up a little bit with a modern format. Second and third links to my books blogs. I did do a work on Raja Yoga by the same author. It's a pseudonym. Yogi Ramacharaka is presumed to be William Atkinson, actually a New Thought pioneer, a prolific editor, edited hundreds of works, a publisher, author. He had to have been a relatively erudite sort of dude. He basically spent the last 20 years of his life writing non-stop. I sympathize. But it's an interesting work, but this one is a little bit different from Raja Yoga. That one was very hands-on. It was mainly mind practices, mental practices to increase self-awareness and focus, to try to discover the nature of self, of the I, the actual, the self that goes beyond the physical or even mental plane, that goes into the spiritual sort of Hindi realm. This one is not quite the same. It's much more philosophical. It's much less hands-on, and it seeks to explain from a much more Western perspective than the former work. The Raja Yoga work was mostly Eastern philosophy, vaguely reinterpreted and turned into a pragmatic field for mental awareness. That's essentially the Raja Yoga work. Quite good. This work is also good, but it's not hands-on. This is like 75% a Western view of the East, and I believe this one was actually written first, and that may have had something to do with it. Maybe he got criticism and feedback, and they're like, well, you didn't explain how to actually do any pragmatic practices here. It was just a philosophical diatribe. It is interesting, though. There are two entire sections that are just about the concept of evolution and trying to overlap what was then understood to be the field of biological evolution with spiritual ascent, the idea being that they're twain, they're paired, one sort of informs the other, that you can use evolution, which at the time, the early 20th century, it's still very much a hot debate over these things. Lamarck versus Darwin, is it real? Did we come from monkeys? And stuff like that. It was a big thing. It was the main philosophical discussion of society for a good decade. That being said, it made sense to try to, if you're teaching a Western audience about these Eastern principles, say, oh, well, it's basically the same debate. It's basically the same premise, at least, that things have gone from simplistic life forms that in some cases they don't have any nervous system, they're basically just a chunk of gelatin or a single cell, and if you look at the claim of evolution, the theory therein, over time, change has occurred. Now, interestingly enough, and of course we can excuse Atkinson for this, he seems to prefer the Lamarck theory. At least in the spiritual sense. Now, he alludes to it in the biological, but he may be technically alluding to the spiritual, and it's not entirely clear. The idea with Lamarck, as opposed to Darwin, Darwin would say giraffes have long necks. The famous example is giraffes. They have a very long neck. Darwin would say, well, over time, generation after generation, smaller-necked giraffes tended to be outcompeted by longer-necked ones. There was therefore genetic shift. Over time, the gene pool changed to prefer longer necks because the ones with smaller necks tended not to pass on their genes at all. They tended to die more often at a younger age. Therefore, they didn't mate. They didn't produce progeny. Lamarck would say that over time, giraffes stretched their necks out to reach higher leaves, and over time, this caused a genetic change. Now, at least in the sense of inheritance, we know Lamarck was wrong. We understand that Darwin's theory with regards to this. By the way, Darwin had a copy of Mendel's work, and apparently the wax was never cut on it. He received it as a gift and never read it. And he could have put two and two together, and this is an old tale as well. If he had just read Mendel's work, it would have shaved many years off of parts of his theory, and he probably would have had an aha moment and been 10 times as wealthy and famous as he already was. That being said, we now know that at least in the sense of inheritance, if you're accepting evolution at all, and of course, as a rational individual I do, Darwin was correct. It has nothing to do with you stretch. That's like saying that if you want your children to be basketball players, you should go and go on a stretching rack. It doesn't really work that way. We know that's not how genes work. It's an interesting work. It's one part the historicity of it, the historical period and the subject matter here, especially when it touches on evolution, is sort of like a look at 100 years ago what the cultural debate was, number one. Number 2, this shows a decidedly Western view of Eastern religion. Unlike Raja Yoga, which is very hands-on, if you want to study yoga in the pragmatic sense, if you actually intend to study it, I would recommend Raja Yoga. This particular work, though, if you're into any combination of anthropology, sociology, or New Thought, sort of the Western occult tradition, this would actually be the superior work. And again, similar page length, similar basic content, same pseudonym, same actual author, presumably Atkinson. Altogether a good work, definitely worth reading. Again, link in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon. Second and third links are to the books blogs. The Raja Yoga work is there available under the spirituality header. I will be doing the Hatha Yoga one as well, although I have a couple of other works that I'm intermediately working on at the same time. That's about all. Peace out.